Good morning. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the National Housing Conference here in Melbourne. I hope that you all enjoyed day 1 and I'm pleased to welcome you back to our second full day of activity and presentations. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, welcome to the conference. I want to begin, of course, by acknowledging that we are gathering and holding this event today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And on your behalf and for myself, I pay respects to Wurundjeri elders, past and present. For those of you who are joining us online, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands from which you are tuning into us. And you will know what land you're on, I trust. And I want to, on your behalf, publicly pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, in those places as well. I also want to welcome and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us at the conference today, both here in Melbourne and online. For the benefit of our international guests, who you will meet in just a moment, I just want to say that when we do gather here, we do have this practice of acknowledging the fact that the lands that we're meeting on and where we conduct our business are lands that have been continuously cared for by many, many generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over not just hundreds or thousands, but in fact tens of thousands of years. And that's one of the things that make our places in Australia so unique within the global context. Well, I now invite you to start packing your bags and to get ready to leave Australia behind, because this morning we're off on a very special international study tour where we will explore social housing innovation on 2 continents and in 3 different countries. But before we do that, and while you're getting ready and dusting off those passports, I'd like to ask our sponsor for the session, Ventia, and particularly Angela Williams, to come and say a few words. Thanks, Angela.
Good morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we meet on today, the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. My name's Angela Williams and I'm the General Manager of Ventia's Community and Housing Business. Ventia is a 35,000 strong organisation that's been providing services to the housing sector for over 20 years in Australia and New Zealand. We're very proud to sponsor AHURI and today's conference, and we resonate very strongly with the themes of the conference: resilience, connection and transformation. It's been an unprecedented 2 years, extreme weather events, pandemics, significant changes in tenant needs, and of course, technological and sustainable development. At Ventia, we're very passionate about making infrastructure work for our communities. Ventia's work in the social housing sector includes asset management and maintenance services to over 65,000 properties in Australia and New Zealand. More importantly, that means we provide services to over 130,000 tenants. We see this as an absolute privilege to provide essential services to so many tenants in our community, and we do so with respect, with empathy and without judgment. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge my 3,550 team of subcontractors, staff and call centre operators who are responding to the New South Wales floods and storms. Thank you very much. As one of the largest end-to-end asset maintenance providers in the sector, we see our role as delivering timely and quality but tenant-centric services, alongside of building capacity and capability in our subcontractor base, bringing governance to the sector and bringing technology and sustainability innovation. We do this by embedding lived experience. We have over 93 tenants that work in our organisation, which we're very proud of, and we have a number of people who have come from social housing or grew up in social housing, who in turn work in our business and form part of our management teams. We work closely with key stakeholders, with technology partners, with research institutes to try and bring a redefinition of customer excellence, but also new thought leadership in how we can do things better. We're very excited to sponsor today's event and move around the world because I haven't been able to travel for a very long time. So thank you very much, Tom and AHURI, and we're very pleased to sponsor today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. We do appreciate Ventia's sponsorship, particularly as I think we're all planning to fly business class today. Look, as we start our international study tour, once again, I hope you've dusted off those passports that have lain dormant for 2 years or more. I hope you've looked at your travel brochures because it's going to be a whirlwind tour, but one I hope will stay with us for a very long time. Now, fasten your seatbelts. We're about to land at our first destination, Amsterdam. And I should have had this playing while I was talking. So do double check your bags, make sure they're concealed in the overhead lockers, all that sort of thing. We are about to take off on our international study tour looking at social housing innovation. Well, we're off to Amsterdam, our first stop. When we first look around the city of Amsterdam, it's easy to see the feature that it is perhaps most famous for, its canals. They have an impressive history. Most of them were created through a citywide planning scheme that started in the early 1600s. And for those of us who are involved in housing systems and the built environment, it is great to see that town planning has such a long and illustrious history. There are more than 100 kilometres of canals in Amsterdam and more than 1,500 bridges. There's a lot to see, with museums and art galleries such as the Rijksmuseum and the Van Gogh Museum celebrating the cultural importance of Dutch artists. But now it's time for us to get off the canal boat tour, because instead we're going to look at how the people of Amsterdam and the Netherlands are providing affordable homes for those who live there. The Netherlands is the second most densely populated country in the EU, and housing is at a premium. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Richard Ronald from the University of Amsterdam, who will be joining us as our first presenter in this whirlwind tour. Richard Ronald is Professor of Housing, Society and Space at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Hello, Richard. And he is a Distinguished Visiting Professor in Housing Studies at Hong Kong Metropolitan University as well. Richard has been a guest professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK, the National University Singapore, and the Kyung-hee University in South Korea. His research focuses on the role of housing in social, economic and urban transformation, there's that keyword, in Europe and in the Asia Pacific. It has been funded by various bodies, including the EU Research Council and the ARC, and the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Richard is currently editor of Palgrave Macmillan's Contemporary City book series and was the former editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Housing Policy. Richard sits on various funding and scientific advisory boards, including here in Australia. He originally graduated from Nottingham University and Nottingham Trent University in the UK and was a doctoral and postdoc fellow at Kobe University in Japan. Richard, thank you for joining us. I'll hand over to you now to take over the rest of the tour around your wonderful city. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Can you all hear me? Yeah, I'll wait for you to nod to let me know what's going. I'll start sharing my screen in a second. And the first thing to say is thank you very much for this invitation. It's great to be at an international conference again, although it feels remarkably similar to sitting in my living room in the middle of the night talking to myself. But with that, I'll hopefully start sharing my screen. Please bear with me.
That's all right, Richard. And I might just add, while you're going through that little technical challenge there, that there is the opportunity to share or to ask questions of all of our presenters, and you can share those with me via the conference app, and I will get those questions later. And we'll have a little bit of time at the end of each presentation and perhaps a little bit more at the end to ask a couple of questions as well. So.
Now, we did a technical check, but it seems it's not coming through. I'm just wondering, I'm having a technical crisis, I'm afraid. Are you there, Tom?
I'm here. Yep, we can hear you, we can see you. We can't...
Can you see my screen?
We cannot see your screen, no. That's all right, just relax.
Okay.
Relax, Richard. Try again.
I'll try again.
No international trip is without its hitches, so that's fine.
I have no idea why it's not allowing me to do this. 1 second, please.
That's okay.
Let's just try and relaunch it again. It's always worked in advance before. I don't know why it's not now. Okay, let's share. So we should have had a run through, I guess, when we did the technical check.
We don't have them over there, do we? No. All right.
I would suggest, Tom,
yep.
Despite the very wonderful and dramatic introduction, that maybe you could go to Christian or Kawata-san and come back to me after I've been to the technical room.
I think that might be a good idea. So perhaps what we might do is just reroute our journey at the last minute. Richard, we will return to you. And if it's okay, I'm going to now invite, Nahoko is actually up next in Japan, so it's a slight detour. But we will quickly jump back on the plane and reroute to Japan. And Nahoko, I hope you're not caught too unawares by our premature arrival in your wonderful city. It really is a wonderful place, a place famous for its technological marvels, obviously one of the busiest pedestrian crossings in the world, and the futuristic sci-fi dimension to cities like Tokyo is well known, but also obviously another place with a deep and long culture. But today it's my pleasure to introduce our next tour guide a little bit in advance, and that is Nahoko Kawata from Oita University. Nahoko, hello. Nahoko is an Associate Professor of Housing Studies in the Faculty of Education at Oita University in Japan. Nahoko received her MA and her PhD in Human Science from Kobe University in Japan, which is where Richard also studied, we just learned. Nahoko's research interests are the relationship between housing and family change and gender, social inequality and poverty. She is currently working on a research project that focuses on the changing housing affordability and aspirations of the younger generations of Japanese. This work is supported by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Nahoko has served on numerous local government advisory committees and boards dealing with housing policy and with public construction of housing. She's also one of the directors of the Japan Housing Council. So please join me in welcoming Nahoko Kawata.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for giving me the chance to have a presentation here today. My name is Nahoko Kawata, and I am an associate professor at Oita University, a national university in Japan. And it's now 7 a.m. in Japan. So,
thank you for getting up so early.
And I'm participating in this conference from my university office. I'm so nervous, and I haven't slept since last night. And I'm not very good at speaking English, so please, I'm sorry in advance. So
it's very clear, thank you. Yeah.
okay. Oh.
Wow, fantastic.
Can you see my PowerPoint?
We can, Nahoko, thank you.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about social housing and the housing safety net in Japan. Japan probably has a different context on the issues of housing affordability. The most serious issues facing Japan is a low growth economy. The economy has been struck in a low growth trap since the financial bubble in the early 1990s. The total population got into a downward spiral after peaking in 2010. And a major factor of the population decreasing is the low birth rate and aging population. The percentage of the elderly aged 65 and over in 2021 is 29.1%. And the birth rate in last year marked 1.3, which was very low. The number of households is also expected to peak in 2011 and begin to decline in 2023. However, the population and households are shortly projected to decline even in Tokyo, the capital of Japan. As Japan enters the post-growth phase, the most significant housing trend is the rise in vacant houses. The number of vacant houses in 2018 was about 8.5 million. It accounts for 30.6% of the total housing stock. The rise in vacant home is not just a problem for regional cities and small to mid-sized cities. There are many vacant houses even in big cities like Tokyo and Osaka. Finding a solution to the vacant housing problem has become a national issue. Against the backdrop of a degrowth society, national government has developed a market-oriented and stock-based housing policy since the mid-1990s. Public housing provided directly by local governments and public corporations accounted for less than 10% of the total housing stock, even during the period when it was the highest, and in recent years, it has declined to 5%. On the other hand, a new safety net system has been established to provide housing for the vulnerable by utilizing the housing market and the existing housing stock. The Housing Safety Net Law has been passed in 2009 and revised in 2017. The Housing Safety Net targets vulnerable households, including low-income households, elderly people, families with children, disabled people, victims of natural disasters, and others. In this housing safety net, not only public housing, but also private rented housing is expected to play an important role in providing housing for the vulnerable. There is there has been a marked increase in the number of people with housing affordability issues. The rent index has been decreasing gradually over the past 10 years, while the housing price index has been rising significantly. Looking at the use of mortgage loans, the annual income multiplier for home question finance has increased markedly because of the deregulation of housing finance. It is now possible to acquire a house entirely with a mortgage without a down payment. The repayment period of the mortgage is up to 50 years. It is now possible to pay off the mortgage by the age of 80. How will we be able to pay off a mortgage with a small pension in old age? Especially among younger households, the ratio of housing cost to disposable income has been increasing. This is due to the increasing number of young people with unstable employment and low income. Young people are paying a higher percentage of their housing cost in recent years than during the bubble period, when rent and housing prices were the highest. The lack of housing affordability is a factor in preventing young people from being independent and the declining birth rate. Under these circumstances, public housing in Japan faces several challenges. Construction of public housing was started to cope with the housing shortage after the World War II. The stock is aging, but due to the financial difficulties of local governments, its renovation has not been carried out. The increase in the number of elderly people, especially elderly singles, and the decline of communities are also major issues. The average application rate shows 3.8 applicants per unit and has decreased in recent years, but the rate in Tokyo is about 20. The demand for public housing is still high. Supply is not sufficient to cover the total number of housing vulnerable people. However, most local governments established plans to shrink the public housing stock due to the severe financial situation and the projected population decline. For local governments, how to rehabilitate public housing without increasing the economic burden has become a serious concern. Therefore, public and private partnership, so-called PPP, and private finance initiative, PFI, are becoming popular in projects such as reconstruction. In addition, the sales of surplus land created by the consolidation of public housing and the attraction of private facilities are major points in the projection evaluation. In the past, all processes such as design, planning, construction, and management are carried out directly by local governments, but in recent years, there has been an increasing in the number of projects in which design and construction are entrusted to private companies. In addition, as a response to the declining birth rate and aging population, promoting the occupation of younger households and families with children has become a major issue. For this reason, it is recommended that medical, nursing, and child support facilities be included in the rebuilding process. And this is an example of a reconstruction project in Osaka. This project was also implemented by PFI, and private companies designed and constructed the building. Surplus land was sold to the private sector as land for detached housing for young family households. Another redundant site that's a senior citizen support facility. This model of public housing reconstruction is being planned not only in large cities, but also in regional small cities. Next, I would like to introduce the innovations in disaster recovery public housing. Sorry. A growing number of natural disasters have been striking Japan over the last few decades. 30,000 units were built after the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. And 1,900 units were built after the 2016 Kumamoto earthquake. And 300 units were built after the 2018 July heavy rain in Okayama. Regarding the construction cost of public housing, for general public housing, 50% is subsidized by national government, and local government bears 50%. However, in the case of disaster recovery public housing, national government subsidizes 75% of the construction cost, and the local government bears only 25%. Therefore, local governments are highly motivated to engage in advanced projects such disaster public housing. So there are several notable innovations in the disaster recovery housing project. While most of general public housing projects are high-rise and large-scale community, many of disaster public housing projects are human scale, such as detached houses and mid or low-rise housing complexes. For consideration of the victims, especially the elderly victims. This is housing, And this is a public housing for young family in same housing estate. The project is designed to create a balance in the community as is the case in areas where elderly households live together. Utilization of locally produced building materials is also recommended in order to reduce construction costs and stimulate the local community. This is an example of detached houses. And this is an example, an apartment complex. Many building materials made in the area are used in the interior. Regarding some projects, mid and high-rise apartment complexes are built by Udun. CLT is used for the structure of this public housing. This public housing is a three-story wooden structure. And this is a public housing built in the area where a big fire occurred, but wooden construction was adapted on purpose. This wooden public housing have a high fireproof performance. In addition, housing with distinctive designs that reflect the story, the history and culture of the area are built. And there have been several innovations in the rehabilitation of public rental housing by GUR. This is a case study of a typical UR housing in Tokyo that was renovated as a co-housing for elderly people and multi-generational households. And this this UR housing is located in the same housing complexes. This has been renovated as a shared housing for young people and students. The UR's rental housing stock is very old, and the problem was that there were many vacant units. Renovation by Muji. Do you know Muji? A Japanese famous retail store. Are being carried out in UR housing. These renovated houses are also popular among younger generations, bringing vitality to aged housing complexes. In general, Japanese rental housing has an obligation to restore the original condition. However, the UR housing is old, so free renovation by residents is permitted. The DIY housing is also a factor in encouraging creative young people to move in. There are 3 UR housing complexes in Osaka City with DIY level. And finally, I'd like to introduce the new housing safety net housing. Safety net housing is a project to use vacant private rented housing as an alternative to public housing. Local governments register vacant houses that reach a certain standard as safety net housing and supply them to vulnerable people. This suggestion has the following three features. One is a legislation system for rental housing that doesn't reduce occupancy by people in need of housing security. Second is that financial support such as repair subsidies for landlords and rent reduction for residents. And third is housing support for people who need housing security. However, the new safety net housing still has many challenges to overcome. The safety net housing is not always affordable. The number of registered housing is not small, but most of the registered housing is occupied by general households and is not provided to vulnerable households. There is a slight advantage for the landlords. So it is quite unclear whether this project will be successful, but it is expected that Japanese housing policy will continue to shift more and more towards market-oriented and stock-based. The background of social housing in Japan is very different from the other countries, but I hope this will be some help to everyone. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Nahoko. Thank you so much, Nahoko. Thank you for stepping in very quickly there as we reorganised our tour. And thank you too for getting up so early in the morning to be with us at a more civilised hour here in Australia. Some interesting innovations there from Japan. We're now going to try and go back to Richard and to see if we can connect again with him. Richard, hello, welcome back. We've had a very quick detour to Japan, and it's wonderful now to be back in Amsterdam again.
Yes.
Let's see how we go this time. And I will just say, due to those technical difficulties, we are running a little bit behind in our schedule now, so just to keep you on your toes.
Apologies for the technical breakdown. In my defence, it's exactly the same computer that I shared screen with you last week. It gave me some problem with primary settings. And of course, it was fixed by turning everything off and turning on again.
Of course.
So I will
Thank
try
you.
to share my screen one more time.
Oh, it's looking hopeful.
And hopefully now, you're all seeing a beautiful PowerPoint presentation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Well done.
So let's go. So get back
Thanks.
on that canal boat.
We will.
So I was saying about canals and 16th century housing. And get off again, and let's get ready for another tour. Pleasure to be asked to do this. In this tour, it's quite involved to discuss the social housing sector in the Netherlands. And I'm going to try and do two stories today that kind of interconnect. And the first one is actually kind of the crash course, the overview of 100 years of social housing in Amsterdam, because it has a very unusual specific pathway that's quite revealing and interesting. And also the second story is about, actually I'm going to talk about Dutch housing. The second story is more about Amsterdam itself and about the changing conditions for starters on the housing market. And I'm currently involved in projects with the City of Amsterdam where we're looking at changing housing conditions for young people. And I have this second title here, The Rise and Fall Revival of Dutch Social Housing. And that's to allude to a point that, there's been ups and downs in the social housing system. And as of last month, or as of January, we have a new government, and there's a real new strategy being applied to the current, what's called a housing crisis that we're having in the Netherlands. So my first slide, hey. So let's go back 100 or so years. Your two Dutch words for today are woningwet and woningcoöperaties. And the woningwet is the housing law from 1901. I'm going to talk in very broad brush terms for the interest of time. I can explain more if you take me to dinner, Although I understand Julie Lawson's in the audience today, and she'll be available in the lobby afterwards to discuss details of Dutch social housing and her new Housing 2030 report. Anyway, getting back to housing associations. So what's the key difference is that in 1901, local authorities were made responsible for housing. And one of the main things they did was made finance available for non-profit housing organizations who were interested in improving social housing. So this is all kinds of different organizations, from the Catholic Church to the Tram Drivers Union. And it's nothing to do necessarily with a left-wing movement towards social housing in the Netherlands. And what we see at the beginning of this century is this surge of people getting together and forming an association and applying for money and building housing for themselves. Skipping ahead to kind of the next kind of big shift in social housing in the Netherlands, and this is the 6 to 8 minute version of the whole story. We have years after the war, there's been no building due to German occupation. There's been war damage, and there's also been an upcoming baby boom. And there's basically hundreds of thousands of houses needed. And the government essentially turns to the housing corporations and subjects them to state imperatives, provides them with the resources they need to build en masse. So increasingly, the housing associations turn to big projects, expanding urban areas and urban neighborhoods, hundreds of thousands of units over a year. Object subsidies, heavy kind of government loans for these housing associations to build. So here in the picture, you have this typical kind of modernist housing that was being built in the 1950s. The lower picture here is something from the 1980s. And we have a shift from this kind of approach where the government is co-opting basically the housing associations to build housing for them. Housing associations are still in name kind of private organizations. So it's a thing to note at this point is that this is not the welfare state. It's not an extension of the state. The state is using these private organizations, but it involves large amounts of public resources to build this housing. And so by the 1970s and 80s, around 10% or 12% of public spending is going to housing. But housing has been, the supply has been resolved to the extent that 40% of all housing in the Netherlands or thereabouts was social housing by the end of the 1970s. So the state begins a recurring process for the next 30, 40 years of actually trying to move away from social housing and towards a private market, which never seems to go quite right for them. So we see a shift in the 1980s toward more demand subsidies, which allows housing associations to build more higher quality housing, because low-income residents, if they can't afford the housing, they can afford higher rents from social landlords because the government gives them a rental subsidy. And we move into, and also kind of the housing market was a big downturn in the late 70s, early 80s. And so housing providers were brought back in, social housing providers, to fill the gaps. As we move into the 80s and 90s, or the 90s in particular, we have a moment where the government again reevaluates its position on social housing. And we have a kind of root and tree restructuring of the social housing sector. And this can be described in great detail, but essentially we can think of what's called a balancing operation occurs, where the housing associations are cut loose from their ties with the government. They're made more fully independent. Their debts are essentially wiped. A new system of finance is created with a number of semi-government organizations that guarantee loans from money markets for housing associations to build. And associations are given a task to kind of do a more traditional role of providing housing in a more market-mixed housing system. What we have in the 1990s and 2000s is, to some extent, a growth in the power of social housing companies. They're now private, they professionalize, they have these debts are cancelled, but also housing prices, land prices start going up. And essentially housing associations become very, very successful, wealthy organizations. They start to professionalize, become hybrid kind of style organizations, and we have a reduction. And so we go from more than 1,000 housing associations in the early 90s to less than 800 by the end of the 90s to around about 400 today. And I'd say there's some reputation damage in the 2000s to the extent that a lot of housing associations got involved. For example, Vestia involved, what do they do with their wealth? Well, they invested in derivatives leading up to the global financial crisis and lost lots of money, There's other things I could talk about. But we essentially, after that, enter a new phase of social housing. This is Mr. Rutte, our Prime Minister since 2010, still going strong. And his party, Stefan Bloch, is the character behind him, was the Minister of, well, what was housing? They cancelled the housing ministry, but was basically in charge of the housing portfolio during the first years of the first Rutte cabinets. And essentially, during the 2010s, during the post-crisis period, a lot of interventions are made to rebalance the housing market. First of all is a rethinking of the allocation of social housing. So housing associations are told they should only allocate housing to low-income households. Previously, they had much more autonomy in controlling who they lent to. The second key thing is that a landlord levy is introduced, and this is essentially a tax that affects the providers of low-cost rental housing. So it largely targets actually social housing companies to the tune of about 2 billion a year. And there's various reasons for this, but one of them includes the idea that it would create more of a level playing field with the private sector in the production and sale of housing. A third thing to say is about some fancy words here. VOZ-waarde and the woonwaarde-stelsel. So this is essentially the private rental sector in the Netherlands supplements, or part of it supplements the social housing sector, in that historically about 2/3 of the social rental sector is regulated and often falls under the same rules as social housing. And this system is achieved through a point system. So if you're a tenant and you think you're paying too much rent and that the quality of your house is the same as a social rental unit, you can ring your local authority who will come around with an inspector, allocate points to your house, and if your housing points fall under a certain scale, that unit is then associated, allocated to a rent-regulated system. And even actually going back to the 1990s, as a private landlord, you'd also have the people allocated to you as tenants rather than going to the market. That's changed. And the last thing to say is that we have a new Housing Act in 2015-16 and the deregulation of rental contracts. And what I mean by that is that up until that point, people who have a rental contract have security of tenure and there are relative controls on the increase in rent for them. And what the new Housing Act did, or part of what it did, was allow new contracts to be issued on a 2-year basis. And of course, landlords, this has proliferated in the period since. So between 1990 and now, we see, or until a few years ago, a kind of dismantling and undermining of the social housing sector. But this is not the end of the story. So now I zoom into Amsterdam, because Amsterdam is kind of a bit of an epicenter of the peaks and troughs of the Dutch housing system. It's the largest city. It used to be very much a working class city, but since 20 years ago, it's become the center of the financial sector. And I'll show you a second, the house price increases have been remarkable. These two graphs illustrate a key point for people in Amsterdam, or a key issue. So what we see is from these policies that were rolled out in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, is we see a shift and growth in home ownership in Amsterdam. And that's largely at the cost of the social rental sector. And this is in part due to kind of new building is mostly home ownership orientated, but also that social housing companies, woningcorporaties, are encouraged to sell much of their stock. They do this voluntarily, but pressure is imposed at various times. And what we also see in the graph on the right is how much the decline in allocations of social units in Amsterdam. So we have a system where it used to be relatively easy for people on low to middle incomes to access social housing, to a situation now where there are a waiting list of more than 12 years and very difficult to get into social housing. And a particular issue for middle income people. Okay. I'll do it that way then. Okay, so this is my shock slide to some extent, but you're Australian, so you're used to ridiculous house price increases. And this is what we see in Amsterdam since 2014. We have this comeback in the market, and Amsterdam has led kind of the revival in house prices. And actually, much of the country during the Corona, we see another boom, that 7% in Amsterdam in 2021. But we also see an even bigger revival in prices in the rest of the country. And essentially prices have doubled. It's created incredible pressure on the Amsterdam market. And we see a restructuring of the system. One of the key factors has been that the regulations that were brought in, especially under Rutte, have once again, after a century, made investing as a landlord quite attractive again. So in this graph, you see this is from the 4 major cities of the Netherlands. But you see that after the crisis, after 2013 or so, that we get people waiting to buy coming into the market and kind of more fluidity in transactions in current owners. But what we also see is a later decline of that from 2016 onwards as investor landlords come in. So there's been a kind of shock of buy-to-let investor landlords in the Netherlands, and especially in university cities and the city of Amsterdam. Now, I put this slide in a bit last minute just to be able to illustrate what the housing sector looks like in Amsterdam. This is from 2019. And you see it's a little bit more complicated than other places. The home ownership rate actually has stagnated over the last 5 years. And it's stabilized at around 30%. What we see is social housing, which used to be more than 2/3 of housing in the city, i.e. regulated housing provided by housing associations, is now about 37%. But housing associations have also increased their stock of housing that's kind of above the rental border for social rental housing, that's basically targeting middle-income people. But what we also see is that the private rental sector has shifted, and that whereas 10 years ago, most housing in the private rental sector was regulated, now we see it liberalized. And I have a simple graph here, or a simple table that illustrates that change. So I've reduced the categories here, so it's not simply social housing, it's regulated versus liberalized rent housing. So regulated rent includes housing owned by housing associations, but also private landlords whose housing is regulated in the same way. And we see the top line here, this massive decline in the numbers of rent-regulated housing that's available. And that's in large part due to the measure to allow housing values to be included in the calculation of the point system that was on the previous slide that I didn't explain completely. And what that means is a lot of houses, as tenants have left, have been reassessed and have come out of the system of regulated rents. And so what you see is some growth, but stable growth in home ownership, and massive growth in liberalised rental housing. So these are kind of free market rental units. And rents have also increased massively in recent years. I said I've been doing research with low-income people, and I'll turn to that more in a second. What we see in the population of Amsterdam, of people aged 25 to 34 who live there, is a massive reorientation around the cost of living in Amsterdam. And basically these figures show you this massive increase in the number of high-income younger adults, basically. So when we say high income, that means people who earn more than 2 times the modal income. And that's grown from 17% of that age cohort to 40%. Meanwhile, the amount of low-income people has fallen from 53% to 34%. So there's kind of a mismatch between the population of the city and the population arriving in the city and the constitution of the housing system. And this shows you quite specifically how it's younger people who have been affected by how the housing system's changed. So older people very much, things have changed for them. There's less people in rent-regulated housing. What we see is that young people who were once in 2005 largely in in rent-regulated housing, and now in the liberalised rental sector, which has grown massively in the last couple of years. So I have a few minutes. I'm doing okay for time. I said we are having a housing crisis in the Netherlands. Well, this inaffordability of housing for young people, and the fact that most people, if they want to get into Amsterdam, really have to rent in a very expensive sector, has led to unrest. And we see that people are basically, I wouldn't say displaced, but cannot move to the city where the jobs are. I put these 2 photos in that illustrate very different vibes to these 2 different housing protests from these 2 eras. In 1972 here, they're protesting against the increasing of social rents that occurred when they improved the housing stock, social housing stock, and introduced rental subsidies. But on the right, this is from from last year. And in September and October, we had 2 large protests about housing affordability and housing policy. And this really played a strong role in the election last year. This kind of discontent So other than Corona, this has been kind of one of the biggest political issues. Now, how has the city of Amsterdam been dealing with the shortage of housing, especially for younger people? Well, one of the major policies for the last 15 years has been the rollout of different kinds of co-living. So this is one of the innovations that's worth reflecting on. So Amsterdam, actually, as you see from the graph on the left, so Amsterdam is, around about a tenth of the size of London, but has this huge co-living housing sector moving in. And what I mean by co-living is this kind of commercialized sector of people who live together. Usually you have a small room to yourself and have shared facilities, but it runs at different scales. And you can see from this picture on the right, this is called Our Domain. And this is a recently completed project, hold on timer, in the city of Amsterdam that houses, I think it has more than 1,000 units in here. So it's lots of small units for young people, although there is some diversity in that there are one-bedroom apartments and larger apartments for wealthier young people. And these are rented out also kind of on relatively temporary contracts at quite a high price, but do give people access to housing in the city. There's different types. So I started this presentation by saying there's lots of kind of potential for different kind of solutions in Amsterdam. And one of the interesting things about the boom in co-living is that actually social housing providers are also involved. The diversity of different groups involved in this massive supply of housing, which is more than a quarter of all housing being built over the last 10 years. One type is student hotels. Student hotels are essentially not really hotels. They're places that are kind of built on the theme of a hotel, and students can have contracts and live there, or young people can have contracts to live there for up to a year on that contract. Therefore, it's still known as a hotel. You'll see in the top left picture, it says Hotel Janssen. In the small print, it says not for tourists. And this is where we put actually our postgraduate students who visit at the University of Amsterdam. Casa 400 here is a very interesting example of such an experiment, because this actually generally functions as a regular hotel, especially in the summer and Christmas holidays when students aren't in the rooms. Another thing that's been an innovation in Amsterdam, or in the Netherlands, has been what's called friends contracts. So these were innovated in the mid-2010s by housing associations who didn't really have a legal framework to rent out their properties to groups of young people. So traditionally, social housing was built for families and rented to households with a head of household kind of on the agreement. So friends contracts allow groups of 4 or 5, for example, young people, often students, to live together for up to 5 years on their agreement. It continues to be social housing, but with different criteria on what is affordable housing, in the sense that each person usually would pay about 500 euros. So it's not social housing in the sense that the overall cost of the rent is high, but it's being contributed by a number of adults. These pictures here, so I said this was initiated by housing associations, although actually it has been private companies have really taken advantage of this new legal structure for renting out. And so this B Mine development that's on the waterfront in the city on the north side of the river is quite luxurious, and basically it's apartments built with 2 master bedrooms, and 2 separate people have independent contracts for that unit. And if one person leaves, usually the person who remains will find a new person to replace them. So there's a rolling out of the private sector of this kind of particular, very kind of efficient kind of affordable rental housing, and it's affordable because you have 2 people paying with salaries paying towards the rent. And the final thing I'm going to mention in terms of things being rolled out is co-living experiments involving students and Syrian refugees. So this is, I think this starter block is by Allianz. It's made from ship's containers, and that Dutch students can apply. They write a letter to say what their intentions are, and they are mixed with refugees or people waiting for to be given status as Dutch citizens. So the idea is kind of an integration experiment. And this has been relatively successful, and it's been rolled out in other cities in the Netherlands. So my time's about up. So I have an interesting, hopefully this is my conclusion slide, to kind of cover a lot of ground. I've said there's been a revival in social housing, and I'll get to that. What I say is there's a revival with concern with housing, and in that concern, social providers, voting corporations play a big role. So the first thing to say is how has it responded to house prices and the rise of buy-to-let? Well, it's massively increased the purchase tax for people buying a second property to rent out. So since January 2021, the purchase tax went from 2 to 8%, which really softened those kind of purchases. Another interesting innovation, and we'll see how this works out, is a regulation called Zelfwoonplicht, which is the requirement to occupy. It's difficult to translate, but essentially, if you buy a former social rental unit in Amsterdam or a new build unit, from now on, you'll be expected to live there for a fixed period of time in order to prevent that house being rented out. So it won't be transferred from being an unoccupied unit into being a private rental sector unit. At the national level, I said this character, the main person in the picture here is Hugo de Jong. Now, I pick on him because he has been the Corona minister during the last 2 years. So he has this reputation. He appears on TV talking about Corona, and his new job is to be the Minister of Housing. However, we haven't quite got a housing ministry back yet, but we are moving in that direction. In the new coalition accord between the political parties who now run the Netherlands, housing features, and one of the things, and there's lots of details to this, again, ask Julie, there's an intention to build more than 1 million homes over the next 10 years. And we're a country of 17 million people, so that's quite an intense approach to building housing, although there's issues with also our plans to be sustainable. And my last point, again, kind of returning to the idea of what's happened to social housing companies over the decades. Well, they get knocked down, but they get up again. And they're very much part of the plan to kind of revive house building and make housing affordable again in the Netherlands, although the approach is different. One is that they are being freed up by they no longer will have to pay the landlord levy in the future, but also that they're focused not building on low-income housing, but they're building for middle-income housing, which in the major cities is a particular problem for affordability. So thank you for that. I don't think I went too much over time.
No, that was great. Thank you, Richard. We appreciate that. Please join me in thanking Richard. Well, we've had to reroute, but we are going to get back on track and finish off as we plan to do in Vienna. So thanks, Richard. And we're now heading to Vienna, capital of Austria, on the beautiful Danube River. Vienna has a population of 2.6 million people within its wider metropolitan area, and that constitutes around a third of Austria's population. There are many things, of course, to see and experience in Vienna. It unfortunately stole the title of the world's most livable city from Melbourne back in 2018 and held that crown for a number of years. It's a city steeped in culture, famous for its association with European classical music. Many composers, of course, lived and worked there. And Vienna is also famous for its grand architecture, particularly in the Baroque and Rococo styles. However, today we're going to see some very different buildings to that. We're going to visit some Viennese buildings, perhaps a bit less ornate, but just as important in the functioning of a modern city. So there are about 220,000 social housing apartments owned by the city of Vienna, and another 200,000 social housing apartments built with subsidies provided by the federal province of Vienna. The City of Vienna's housing agency, Wiener Wohnen, is the biggest public owner of social housing in Europe. And it's from there that we welcome now Christian Schantl, who is the head of international relations for the City of Vienna, Wiener Wohnen. Christian was born in Carinthia in Austria, and he studied physical education and literature. Before joining Wiener Wohnen, he held various positions in particularly the fields of marketing and communication, and among other roles, he has been managing director of the Festspielhaus St. Pölten and the Lower Austrian Danube Festival. He has been the head of marketing for the Austrian Railway Company, OBB, and an executive partner in the Viennese public relations agency, Conta PR. Until 2019, for the preceding 9 years, Christian was head of marketing and communication at Wiener Wohnen, and since August 2019, he has been the head of international relations in that department. So Christian, thank you for joining us. And I will also mention that for both Richard and Christian, it's actually very late at night, and I think we're past midnight now for you. So thank you very much for staying up to be with us and to take us on this tour. I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think Richard is still has still shared his screen, so okay. So I'll try to share my screen right now. I hope it works.
So do I.
As long as there's nobody else who can step in instead of mine. Okay, do you see my screen now?
We'll give it a moment. Yes. Well done.
Okay.
Thanks, Christian.
Well. Okay. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present the Viennese model of affordable housing to you. In my presentation, I would like to present some general facts and figures about Vienna and give you an overview of the Vienna model of affordable housing. Furthermore, I'd like to inform you about the European Green Deal and the renovation wave, and come to an end by presenting the IBA, Vienna's International Building Exhibition. So let's start with some general information about Vienna. Nowadays, Vienna, the capital of the Republic of Austria, is home to 1.9 million inhabitants. Vienna is the fourth richest urban region in the European Union, and besides New York and Geneva and Nairobi, one of the bases of the United Nations. Vienna is the fifth largest city in the European Union, as well as the largest university city within the German-speaking triangle of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Today, more than 50% of all Viennese live in subsidized apartments, either in one of the 220,000 municipal housing apartments or in one of the 200,000 cooperative apartments built with city subsidies. When we have a look at the housing stock by construction period, then we see that a third of the stock was built more than 100 years ago. These buildings shape the image of the city. So it is quite important for the city to maintain the stock and to retrofit them in a way that these houses fulfill the modern standards of the 21st century. We see housing as well as other services for the public, like the public transport system, the water supply, or the waste management, as a basic human right. We strongly believe that public services, including housing, cannot be left to the private market alone. That is why Vienna invests each year up to 400 million euros in housing construction and restoration of older buildings. Another 100 million euros are given to individuals who are unable to afford even subsidized rents. We try our best to prevent gentrification and ensure a stable social mix in the city in general, and also within every individual apartment complex, because that is the best guarantee for good and peaceful neighborly relations. You will therefore not find any no-go areas or ghettos in our city. This is only possible because we provide the middle classes with access to affordable housing. This is the reason why we have relatively high income limits for the allocation of city-owned and subsidized apartments. With this strategy, we prevent that only socially vulnerable groups live in certain neighborhoods. The subsidies are financed from federal taxes and through the general income tax system. This funding through taxation creates a reliable basis for the planning of complex housing programs, which would be impossible under strictly market-dependent housing policies. The funding of social housing construction in Austria is tied to a fixed portion of income tax, which does not only promote the construction of new housing, but also ensures the preservation of existing buildings through renovation. Thus, the buildings can be brought up to the latest technological standard and adapted to the current needs of the residents. The quota is regulated by federal law and amounts to 0.5% of the gross pay of employers and respectively the gross income of employees. On the basis of this tax, Vienna receives an annual amount of about 250 million euros for housing construction purposes from the federal state. Now, for sure, money is a key issue in building up affordable housing. But besides that, there are other important factors that let tenants sleep well. In Austria, for example, we do have a very strong tenancy law. An important role within the Viennese housing policy plays the Wohnfonds Wien, Vienna's land distribution and urban renewal fund. Wohnfonds Wien was funded in 1984 to provide land for state-subsidized housing construction and to supervise the restoration of old houses. As a limited profit organization, Wohnen from Wien coordinates property developers, house owners, municipal departments and service centers of the municipality of Vienna. Wohnen from Wien ensures highly quality and subsidized housing construction and the renovation of older buildings. In addition, Wohnen from Wien is constantly buying land and reserving it for subsidized new buildings. The land reserves amount currently up to 3.2 million square meters. Recent years have seen land and real estate prices in many European cities spiraling out of control. To counteract this development, the city of Vienna amended its building code in November 2018 by introducing the subsidized housing zoning category. If land is thus classified as belonging to a subsidized housing zone, 2/3 of the usable floor space created for housing purposes have as a rule been taken up by subsidized dwellings. This caps rents and safeguards that affordable homes will continue to be constructed across the entire city. In its turn, this ensures the desired good social mix all over Vienna. Another important tool of our housing policy is provided by the Vienna Urban Development Plan, which is formulated by the Municipal Department for Urban Development and Planning in cooperation with experts and other municipal departments and defines the gradual development of the city. This program determines the distribution of building land and green belts, identifies transport infrastructures, and moreover, it highlights the functional interrelations between the city and its environments. And last but not least, we have many frameworks in the building regulations. In comparison with other big cities, Vienna has rather moderate rent prices. A great offer of affordable apartments is still a matter of course in Vienna. To maintain this pleasant situation, even in times when the housing market is under great pressure due to the financial market and the ever-increasing population, the city administration invests annually, as mentioned, roughly 400 million euros in housing construction and restoration of older buildings. With this funding budget, every year around 7,000 good quality affordable apartments are built and over 5,000 apartments refurbished on average. This provides the Viennese with a wide range of good quality affordable apartments. The benchmark rent for category A municipal apartment is 5.81 euros, exclusively taxes and operating costs. When we look at the various dwellings forms in Vienna, then we see that Vienna is a city of tenants. Typically, Viennese people rent rather than they buy property. Over 3/4 of Vienna's population are tenants, with only around 20% living in flats or houses that they own. In total, about 1 million flats exist in Vienna. 750,000 of them are on the market for rent. Out of these, 220,000 flats belong to Wiener Wohnen, and another 200,000 apartments are in the ownership of non- or limited profit housing companies. As already mentioned, the affordable housing sector in Vienna consists of two different forms. On one hand, we have the municipal housing apartments owned by the city of Vienna. On the other hand, non-profit residential construction is operated by non- or limited profit cooperatives or associations. Already in the 1950s, parallel to the social housing construction program of the Viennese municipality, non-profit housing construction has been making a considerable contribution to apartment production. These building companies built about 25% of all new apartments in Vienna in the period from 1956 to 1965. In the 1980s, the city of Vienna built fewer apartments and increasingly transferred this task to non-profit building companies and cooperatives that now developed residential projects subsidized by the city of Vienna. The rental prices are quite identical in both sectors, but nevertheless there are two main differences. On one hand, it's the ownership, and on the other hand, it's the financing contribution that tenants have to transfer to non-profit building associations. This share amounts between 15,000 to 45,000 euros depending on the apartment space. The reason for this change in housing policy was mainly a financial one. Building a municipal apartment means that you have to finance 100% of the land and construction costs. In the subsidized sector, the financial contribution of the city amounts just a third of the total costs. So with the same amount of money, you can build 3 times more apartments. The disadvantage, the city is not the owner of this housing stock and has not as much influence in this stock as within its own. Mostly identical in both systems are the allocation criteria. You have to have a minimum age of 18. The maximum monthly income must not be more than 3,410 euros after tax for a single person, 5,080 for a 2-person household, and 5,750 for a 3-person household. These relatively high income limits, 75% of the Viennese population earn less, provide that the middle class also gets access to Vienna's subsidized housing stock. Everybody who wants to move in a public housing apartment must live in Vienna for at least 2 years on the actual physical address. And you have to be an Austrian citizen or come from a member state of the European Union, or you have an equivalent status. To get one of the municipal housing flats or a subsidized apartment with a procuration fee under 10,000 euros, you also have to fulfill socially orientated criteria. These years, Vienna celebrates the 100th birthday of its municipal buildings. The first one, the Metzlandsthalhof in Vienna's 5th district, you see on this picture. So let's take a closer look at the municipal housing sector of the city of Vienna. What you see here is the map of the city of Vienna with the Danube River and the forest in the west of the city and the floodplain forest in the southeast. Once again, the same picture, but now exposing our public housing complexes. And what's so special in this picture is the fact that you can find our housing stock nearly everywhere. Even in the villa quarters or in the 1st district right behind St. Stephen's Church, you will find municipal apartment housing. Responsible for the building management of the Viennese municipal housing complexes is Wiener Wohnen, Vienna's municipal housing company. It's an enterprise of the city of Vienna. With our 4,000 employees, around 3,000 of them work as caretaking staff. We are Europe's largest manager of municipal properties. Altogether, we look after 1,800 housing complexes containing 220,000 apartments, more than 5,000 business premises or doctors' practices, and nearly 50,000 garages and outdoor parking spots. The second sector of affordable housing in Vienna is the subsidized sector. The newest municipal housing complex was completed in 2004. Since then, the city of Vienna has stepped back from acting as its own property developer and adopted the updated concept of subsidized housing construction. Non-profit construction associations are also colloquially referred to as housing cooperatives. They are responsible for building, renovating, and administrating apartments for the benefit of the general public, and can be organized not only as a cooperative, but also as a limited liability company or as a public limited company. They must be approved by the federal state government as charitable. Such building associations must belong to a federation which carries out a regular close examination of the business activity. They are also subject to the supervision of the state government. Non-profit building associations predominantly build dwellings that are subsidized according to the Housing Development Acts of the provinces. Therefore, for the rent or purchase of an apartment, the funding provisions must be complied with. Non-profit building associations pass on part of the costs for the land and construction of the property to their tenants via the financial contribution. In Vienna, it currently amounts to 12.5% of the construction costs, plus mostly 100% of the basic costs. This sum is proportionally distributed to all tenants of the building. The personal financial contribution is therefore always based on the size of the apartment. In addition, It is reduced by 1% per year in which the property is rented. For used cooperative apartments, the financial contribution is lower than for the first-time occupancy. It is due either when the rental contract for the cooperative apartment is signed or when moving in. Developers' competition are an important tool in the development of new subsidized residential buildings. They are organized by Wohnen for Wien, Vienna's Fund for Housing Construction and Urban Renewal. Project teams composed of project developers, architects, open space planners, and other experts devise precisely calculated implementation concepts for developers' competition. An interdisciplinary jury consisting of city planner experts, architects, garden planners, and borrower representatives then evaluates the entries and selects the best, highest quality project. The winning team then purchases the land at fixed prices. Competition entries are evaluated on the basis of a pillar model. This assessment matrix comprises 4 criteria: social sustainability, architecture, costs, and ecology. The next topic I'd like to point out is European Union's Green Deal. It's the EU's main new growth strategy to transit the EU economy to a sustainable economic model. Presented in December 2019, the overarching objective of the EU Green Deal is for the EU to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050, resulting in a cleaner environment, more affordable energy, smarter transport, new jobs, and an overall better quality of life. Climate change and environmental degradation are an existential threat to Europe and the world. To overcome these challenges, the European Green Deal wants to transform the EU in a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy, ensuring 3 main topics. First, no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. Second, economic growth decoupled from resource use. And third, no person and no place left behind. Between 1919 and 2018, greenhouse gas emissions in the EU were reduced by 23%. A central objective of the EU Green Deal is to set out that trajectory for the EU to be climate neutral by 2050. As a milestone towards this target, the EU Commission proposed a 2030 target to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 55% compared to 1990. The objectives of the EU Green Deal require cleaner buildings and construction sector. The renovation wave is a strategy to renovate buildings to increase their energy efficiency. It prioritizes the decarbonization of heating and cooling, tackling the worst performing building stock, and the renovation of public buildings such as schools and hospitals. EU's building sector plays a significant role in achieving the climate targets and implementing the European Green Deal. Buildings are responsible for about 40% of total energy consumption and 36% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union. It is necessary to increase the energy efficiency of buildings, reuse abandoned and/or unused buildings, and extend the durability of existing buildings, implemented measures to reduce construction waste, and increase the presence of green infrastructure. In the effort of reducing life cycle emissions in the construction sector and attaining climate goals, incorporating principles of circular economy, such as durability, adaptability, designing for disassembly, etc., and the renovation and construction of buildings can have a significant effect. But at the moment, only 1% of buildings undergo energy efficient renovation every year. So effective action is crucial to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. With nearly 34 million Europeans unable to afford keeping their homes heated, public policies to promote energy efficient renovation are also a response to energy poverty, support the health and well-being of people, and help reduce their energy bills. The construction sector faces an enormous challenge to achieve the various European targets, while at the same time providing a sufficient number of additional homes. It can also make a significant contribution to job creation and economic growth after COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, many countries are faced with shortage of skilled professionals and rising construction costs due to the lack and high prices of construction material, longer delivery periods, and rising energy prices. More than 220 million buildings in the European Union, or about 85% of the building stock, were built before 2021 and are not designed to adapt to current and future challenges linked to the climate crisis, nor are in line with the EU's ambition medium and long-term climate goals. Their renovation represents a crucial potential for reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions to reach the 2050 carbon neutrality goal.
Excuse me, Christian, I'm just going to have to interrupt you there. I'm so sorry, but the session will be ending in just a moment. It will cut out by itself. So I'm very sorry to cut you off prematurely. But we really do thank you for that overview of Vienna, and perhaps we've left on that last slide where the IBA was coming up, where you're looking at new social housing. And I will just say to people here in Melbourne that as part of, in the area where we have morning tea, we have an exhibition of Viennese social housing just near the Civica think tank, if you want to have a look at that during the break. But please join with me in thanking our international speakers. Thank you so much for joining us, and for doing so at uncomfortable times of the morning and night. And for the rest of us here in Melbourne, we're going to go and have some morning tea now. Thank you.